So the first one about where's the individual intersect with the social political, what I wrote down is, for me, the individual is the social political and the other way around. And so if we think of our conversations as you know, what were those toys when we were young? You used to turn them around. Kaleidoscopes? Those kaleidoscopes? Yeah, no, with kaleidoscopes, as you turned them, the patterns changed, but they were the one thing. That's what I was thinking about in having conversations, and certainly when I've worked with adults whose parenting behaviour has been on the continuum from not useful to abusive. It's being interested and curious about all the practices, all the beliefs, because I think when we start to segment them up, and again I think that's when we're at risk of putting them into the individual baskets, whereas I think we are whole and complete people. I think we're physical, emotional, spiritual, political, etc., and that if we're talking in the therapeutic range of having those conversations, it has to include all. Because in my head I hear when you don't talk about the whole, then you're actually slicing off a part of someone's identity, and there could be in those different parts of who they are change. That's what I was thinking, that you can actually tap into the change. That's what I'm hearing. Like I can't separate them. It moves and weaves, and how come that bit, and where's that bit fit with that action or not that action? Yeah. Anybody else want to take this off me before I start singing Danny Boy?
I'd like to comment on the socio-political question that's raised. Working with any Aboriginal man or any Aboriginal community, socio-political is a part of that, and we often talk about the journey of survival for Aboriginal people, the displacement of culture, the displacement of people, the imposing or the dominant culture, and the systems put in place by the dominant culture that affected Aboriginal men's status within their communities, their roles and responsibility from the very core. So we talk about that, and it is acknowledged that as a result of the dominant culture imposing its structure on Aboriginal man's roles and responsibilities have diminished throughout the whole of our community and within our society, and that they struggle now to find a place where they feel that they belong, and to belong within themselves as well. So the socio-political is a big factor for Aboriginal men. I can't comment on the men outside of that in other or Anglo-Australian men. I can't comment on that, but certainly for Aboriginal men we know that it is one of the major reasons why the sense of hopelessness has been so prevalent for Aboriginal men. And I could go so far as to say that the shame factor for Aboriginal men and women and children is immense as a result of the church's structures that they put in place in mission management. The shame is crippling for Aboriginal people. Even the shame to go down the street, to go outside of their community, to feel safe and that they have the right to go outside of their area, the designated areas. And in the old days that was the mission, or it was the fringe of the town, for them to go and feel that they are okay to go within certain areas of community still impacts and affects Aboriginal people today. I think we have, then you have the polar situation where to have the right to be able to go and do whatever they want within our community. I think we have Aboriginal people now who aggressively do that as well. They feel that that's my right and I'm going to assert that right to go and do it, and bugger you if if you're in my way or in my vicinity. So for me, observing that within Aboriginal communities, within my own family and my community, I see it as an ongoing issue. There's still not a balance there in regards to shame. And shame, I had it presented to me a couple of weeks ago. I did a workshop, and the lady who ran the workshop said that, sorry, I've got to use one of my electronic devices, isn't this fantastic? Shame is the statement that I am inherently flawed. And I think if we look at the impact for Aboriginal people as a result of colonisation, we have been flawed from the time that any non-Aboriginal people set foot in this country, and that exists today. That's been transgenerational, and it's intergenerational, that we, as a result of the colour of our skin, are flawed. And that children grow up with that, and men especially carry that, that they're flawed because we were perceived as being nothing more than savages. I'm going to use the electronic medium again. This wonderful thing that said, don't know where to put it actually. There was a statement that prior to colonisation, we didn't have bombs, we didn't have poverty, we didn't have unemployment, we didn't have loss or diminished roles and responsibilities, we didn't have a whole lot of things that we have now, but we were called savages. And I think that's a very true statement in regards to the role and responsibility of Aboriginal men being lost, being totally... Aboriginal men are at a point, I think, in their existence as being uncertain about what we should be doing, and so we're embracing the dominant culture, Anglo-Australian culture, and as a result, there's a lot of conflict with that in regards to our roles and responsibilities, and yeah, it overflows from there, I guess.
So thinking about my face-to-face work with men, and thinking about the issues of the social and the political context and the man's individual story of his childhood, his upbringing, his own experiences of violence or sexual assault or whatever it is that may be a part of that story, I think that the main position that I want to take with that is to be incredibly curious about the way that he has grown into being, developed into being the man who's sitting there in front of me in my counselling room. So I do want to hold a curious stance. I don't want to hold a stance of judgment or assumption or of thinking that I know exactly what's going on inside of him. I want to know from him. So one of the things that I'm often listening for and curious about is what I would describe as his own maleness journey. So how has he developed ideas about what it is to be a man? And I think within that, we do live in a culture where ideas about maleness are pretty stereotypical. I call it the rough, tough and hard to bluff syndrome. We're going to see that on, what day is it? Sunday afternoon, as the Roosters and the Sea Eagles come out to battle in the National Rugby League Grand Final. We're going to see a lot of that model of maleness being held up against us about this is what a man, this is what a real, authentic Aussie bloke is like. And that, I think that view of maleness actually crosses culture, and it is, as we've talked about, it has been embedded and developed within kind of ideas of patriarchy. So I'm interested to listen and to dig in a little bit to what his particular journey has been in terms of developing his own sense of identity as a person with a penis, if I can use that word advisedly, as distinct from a person with a vulva or a person with other ways of being positioned. I think, is that the right way? Anyway, well, you got my drift, we're trying, Vicky's encouraged us to move away from the binaries of man and woman, and it's a hard thing to actually do. It's a difficult thing to do, so I'm going to use person with a penis and person with a vulva, if that works for you. It kind of works for me at the moment. So, what's been your journey as a person with a penis into developing your identity? I won't say that to him, of course. The other thing that I want to do is to...
I work with him.
The other thing that I want to be curious about and to listen for is evidence of his shame. And that will come out of listening to his ethical intentions, and it's there. It's there in the tiny little statements that he makes. And so staying curious about his shame is a really helpful way for me to draw him gently into a position where he can say things like, you know, like, I hate what I do, and I really don't like myself, I really want to be different, I don't know how to do this. You know, they're all statements that are genuine expressions of his internalised shame, and repositioning shame to me means taking it out of a place of where the shame is hidden and not spoken about, to a place of safety where he's able to speak about his shame. He's able to own it. And that tells me something about him. That tells me something significant about the kind of man that he sees himself as fundamentally being. Ivan's word of deep down in the base of your heart, what are you thinking and feeling? You know, that kind of vulnerability where a man can open up to that. So I'm listening for that. The question about rage, you know, like, you know, my immediate response to this is, like, the only rage that I experience in the therapy room is my own. You know, it's kind of like, oh gosh, you hear some stories and I just get so cross. You know, so that's my first response. Yeah, and I get kind of rage about our political system, and I get rage when I kind of see the kind of the old models of maleness being perpetuated so frequently. You know, I have a grandson who's 3 years old, and he doesn't like being called by his name, William. He likes being called Buster. You know, I think, okay, yeah, it's kind of like, wow, already at 3 he's being enculturated into what maleness means for him, that he's a bit of a bruiser. And he is a bit of a bruiser at 3, you know, so even though his mum is kind of, he goes to ballet classes, and he does have a doll, you know, and all this kind of stuff that's about changing his perceptions of gender. You know, anyway, so I kind of get some rage about that stuff, but I think the question was probably more about clients' rage. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
We've been working quite extensively with the Toomala Boggabilla community. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. It was one of the communities that the Wood Royal Commission went into because of the rate of child sexual assault up there, and domestic violence as well, and family violence. And there was a point in that community where nobody above 5 years old didn't have a sexually transmitted infection. And we'd been working up there. We actually established our professional relationship up there, and we designed the workshop, the SAM, Strong Aboriginal Men's Workshop, as a result of a consultation with the community up there. And we did the series of Strong Aboriginal Men workshops in Toomala Boggabilla, and then we went on to do a series of workshops around leadership. And one of the members of the community who came along to our workshop, his family are originally from Moree, and he's associated with the Munro family, and the Munro family are a very political family. They were instrumental in acquiring the rights for Aboriginal people to access the public baths, the pool, the swimming pool in Moree. And Eric in his beautiful way was facilitating the workshop, the session, and I think I was facilitating the session, and we broke into groups. And this man that was in our group is also a prevalent pot user, a marijuana smoker, and he's quite volatile. And Eric, he misunderstood something that Eric had said, and I became quite aware of the fact that this could totally blow out to be a blue, because here we had this non-Aboriginal man who's been running this workshop there, and we'd been in the community quite a bit, but this man's so volatile that I became concerned for what was going to take place. And Eric very calmly allowed this man to have power, to feel a sense of power, but he didn't do it in a manner that he humiliated himself or in any way belittled himself. He actually had a conversation with the man, and apologised, and if he believed he was out of place. And the man just said, oh, bugger, I'm going outside. He went outside and he did something that was so profound when he came back in, and that was to walk up to Eric and apologise. And you could have knocked me and my other colleague, Vic Morgan, over with a feather, because we were just absolutely dumbfounded. What I took from that was that to be treated with respect and to have some degree of honour and imposed upon him, where he was treated like another man, but nice and gentle, without aggression, without threat or intimidation. That what he did when he went outside, he's obviously had to think about how he was going to deal with it when he came back in, and what he proceeded to do was proceeded to be really nice. And it was such a shock for us all that we'd mentioned it to Eric later on, and Eric was like, oh, really? But Eric actually did say, oh, did you hear that he apologised to me? And it was one of those moments for us as working with men, with the aggression and the rage that they do carry, where for a non-Aboriginal man to get that response from an Aboriginal man in an Aboriginal workshop was just amazing. It was a moment that for me will live long in my memory, and it'll be a platform for me to use as a measure to say that even the most aggressive and angry men certainly in Aboriginal communities, if treated with the right respect, well, not the right, but treated with respect and courtesy and dignity and allowed to have a voice, then the change can be immediate. It can happen. And so that was, I just want to share that with you as a measure of when we know that this man, his rage, he is violent to his family, but in the workshop he contained himself really well, and he engaged and interacted really well with both his colleagues, his peers, and with us as facilitators. And I think that has, and I know for a fact because I communicate quite a bit with his partner, and she said that he had calmed down considerably after doing the workshops with us, and that it had affected his attitude at home. So, yeah, I just want to share that with you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for that. Well, I'm going to respond also to, just the issue of the social political context and bringing that into the room. Of course, for me as a political activist, it's impossible to get it out of the room. It's in the room. Some of the violence, I think some of the structural and therapeutic violence of the helping professions is that we have artificially pretended we're in some kind of vacuum where this is not present. And what professionalism is sometimes required of us is a level of objectivism that sides with oppression in the name of being a good professional, right? So anytime for me, the social and political context is not present, that's not a natural state. That's a very political act to depoliticize the room. That's quite a bit of work, and it requires quite a bit of propaganda that you're best going to get through some professional discourses that require neutrality and objectivity. So one of the challenges that I get, and I imagine the whole panel and most of us in the room, I'm often critiqued for being too political. And I think that's a pretty interesting accusation. And why I've been critiqued early in my career, so I'm 52, and I've been doing this a long time. When I was younger and blonde and more susceptible to critique about the way I looked as opposed to what I thought, which is just part of patriarchy. I was asked about, how I was going to defend myself from being so political. Like, how is it possible that I was going to be a therapist? Because everybody knew that I was a political activist. And of course, in my head, I was thinking, well, you have to be a political activist to be a therapist. We are required as witnesses to social injustice, because these are issues of human rights. These are, and more than human rights, social injustice, which is a bigger thing. Because these are issues of social injustice and we bear witness to them ever since the Nuremberg agreements, we have an obligation to act against structures of inequity, especially when they side with genocide, which is what we're up against when we're working with Indigenous people in Canada. I know that's not you use Aboriginal people here. I'm talking about First Nations people, Inuit people, and Métis people. So to not be too political is to side with massive politics of oppression. It's not a neutral thing to do. So one of the ways I'd often respond to that, and especially when I was, in trainings and stuff, or asked by clinical supervisors or professors or whatever, how I was going to manage to be able to be an effective and ethical therapist, given that I was a social justice activist, I was like, I'll answer this question, but is everybody else going to answer how they are going to be an ethical therapist given that they have taken like a vow to not do justice? Like, I'm not neutral. You're on to me. I'm not neutral about rape. I'm against it. So, but if everybody who's neutral about rape, can they answer to how they are possibly going to work with rape given that they're neutral about it? And is it really possible that my fellow professionals are neutral about the violence of men, that they're neutral about genocide? I don't think so. You know, I just think we've got this discourse that distances us from the very ethics that drew us all to the work. So I try to get out of these binaries of who are the political therapists and who aren't, because everybody who's working to do justice is on side with this. So this idea of the social political context, it's present now. What I think some people think I do when I work is that I run anti-oppression workshops on the back of my clients. This is not true. I don't start to talk to them about Paulo Freire or Che Guevara or the Zapatistas or no one is illegal, although those things are always going on for me. That's my solidarity team, the people that are holding me up, the ideas that hold me up. But what I'm asking the person are questions that are very much in line with where they are in the social context. So a man who tells me, look, she just wouldn't shut up, I had to hit her. You know, she just wouldn't listen to me. We're already in the political context. And I'm so sorry I hit her, but I'm more sorry she didn't shut up. You know, if she'd shut up, I wouldn't have had to hit her. You know, have you had these conversations or am I unique? Okay, we're in it. This isn't where I start to attack him as a patriarch and give him a 101 course in feminism. I ask him, it sounds to me like you're not okay about the fact that you hit her, or are you? Because I'm confused. I said, no, I'm not okay with the fact I hit her. I said, oh, okay, because it sounded like it was her fault that you hit her. No, I know that's my fault. No, I've been through those groups, I got it. I'm like, yeah, okay. Why is it not okay with you that you hit her? He said, Jesus, Vicki, I'm a man. Men do not hit women. It's like, you sound pretty vehement about that. Where'd you learn that? My father told me that, you know. And now I'm connecting him to a rich history of accountable men within his family, even though his father was probably violent with him as well. There's always multiple stories going on, and the story I'm looking for is a story of ethics. And as soon as he takes that position, like Janella Bird says, I invite his position. Once he has taken a position, I hold him to it. But it's not for me as a feminist to say, you are a patriarch, and here's the position that would be ethical for you to take. That would be me, as Paulo Freire says, I wouldn't be in dialogue with that person. I'd be oppressing him and lecturing him and pathologizing him. It's very patronizing because it assumes this man has no ethics. And again, like I said, everybody's so much more than the worst thing they've ever done. So the kind of questions, so he starts to talk about why she should just shut up. I'm just like, I gotta tell you, there's times I just can't shut up. Do you think it would be okay for my partner to hit me? He's like, oh God, no, of course not, I said, well, where do you think you got invited into ideas that if women don't speak, they should be hit? Do you think that you invented that idea, Joe? Think you're the first guy who hit a woman because she didn't stop speaking? And then we're both laughing. He's responsible for his actions, but he's not responsible for the whole context of patriarchy. He doesn't need a lesson in Feminism 101 or patriarchy. He's probably well-schooled in all of it. He has a different language than academics have for it. He has a knowing in the bones of patriarchy, and he has been the victim of patriarchy. The little dirty secret is that men don't benefit from patriarchy. Capitalism benefits from patriarchy, but individual men are suffering in their lives from this, right? So we gotta get out of this binary of who are the winners and losers when we side things around patriarchy. So then I start to ask him, where'd you learn about this stuff? Whose ideas were these? Do you think these are good ideas? Who benefits from these kind of ideas? That's how he's taking apart the social realm. He doesn't need me to lay that out for him. So while I am a social justice activist, I am not running workshops of anti-oppression stances on the backs of my clients, which is one of the things I think people think we're doing kind of in our workshop. It's okay if I say something about shame. Okay, well, just to go on and address the shame, I'm speaking about a particular relationship with shame that Alan Jenkins calls an enabling shame. There's a shame you do onto people that is a total act of violence where you shame a person. That's not what I'm talking about. An enabling shame is a relationship with shame that speaks to the presence of ethics. I know, for example, in the transgender community, when I've done, and I'm an ally to the trans community, and I have loved family of choice in the trans and gender variant community. When I do something transphobic, I am sick to my gut about it. What's happened is I've gone against everything I value and believe. For many trans people that I love, I'm one of their best allies. And now one of your best allies has done something transphobic. Do you want me to give you an example? Mm-hmm. a loving family, a trans family of a transgender person who identifies as a man, and doesn't identify as a trans man, and a lesbian whom he married, tell me they're going to have babies. And these are going to be the closest thing I have to grandbabies, so I'm very excited. But the first thing that comes out of my mouth is, which one of you is having the baby? And so in that moment, I invisibilized my loved one's choice of identity as a gender as a man, and said, you are your biology. I will be the teller of identity, and you have a uterus. So are you having a baby or aren't you? And then this trans man, who doesn't identify as a trans man, identifies as a man, said, well, Vicky, I'm a man, so I won't be having a baby. And I just felt this massive wave of shame. But it wasn't a shame that this man put on me. It was a shame because I had acted in a way that was against the very ethics that are the heart of my relationship of love in this community, my belonging in this community. That's what was up. I felt shame about that. And then I responded by, like, that shame spoke to me of my ethics. It spoke to me that I had transgressed my ethics. That's an enabling shame. And my response to that was, I am so sorry. I'm really going to work to not do this again. And hopefully the invitation was picked up by him who gave me a hug and saved us and said, it's okay, Vicky. We need you to stay being our ally. You got to figure this crap out because your people are going to continue to do this to us and our children our whole lives. So that's like an example of an enabling shame. I want to engender a relationship with enabling shame for people because it speaks to the fact that they're ethical, but I don't want to leave them in that shame. When someone tells me they feel horrible about hitting their wife, I don't go with the horror of that. People who went to my trauma and resistance workshop, I'm not a lot interested in trauma. I'm really interested in resistance. And so then I'll ask the person, what is it that's got you feeling so bad about that? Because I don't want to leave that man in shame. That's not going to serve him, and that's not going to serve his family when he leaves. And also, I think drugs and alcohol have got so much to do with all of it. The real test for me of ethical practice is when someone leaves, do they want to go get wrecked? Because I think after bad therapy, so many people go get wrecked using drugs to kill the pain of therapy, that it's therapeutic violence, right? So then I'm asking this person, what ethic, or like, I don't say ethic to people, like, what's the value, man? What's at the heart for you that you went against when you hit her? He goes, well, I love my wife. So we're talking about an ethic of love, like a value of love for her, right? Yeah, I just want to say that these political structures, there's political structures in place always in this. What I'm worried about is people who have no shame. The absence of shame is a terrifying proposition. And when I think about the political structures, if we look at violence, men don't invent violence. Men are brought up and trained in a culture of violence and states of violence. And if we look at, say, the last decade, it's been phenomenal what has happened in the Western world in the political sphere, where you have a nation such as the United States lose its shame. That's when I started to get really terrified. When you have a president like George Bush go, America, right or wrong, I'll never apologize. So young kids, young boys in America are listening to their president say, even if you're wrong, man, you don't say you're wrong. Children are looking up to that. So you have a structure. The mega structure is saying we have no shame. We will never admit that we did anything wrong. That creates a culture of violence, right? So I think the political is always there. The political context is always there. It's just whether or not we can do that. My last thing I want to say about that in relationship with shame, this is dangerous, dangerous business. We have to be tender with people and careful with people. You can hold people to account and do it with tenderness. I don't do this in a vehement, strident way. My father is famous in his community for ending fights. And he came from, there was a lot of people physically struggling in his community, in his neighborhoods. And one of his best friends told me some great stories about him, which I would never have known if these men didn't catch me up on this. And what they said is, your dad always found a way to give a guy his dignity. And things that would have ended up in fights, both men can walk away. If they're able to be dignified, they can go. And my dad, and I said, Bill, I just heard the most amazing thing about you. How come you never told me this? And he said, well, Vicky, you always got to give a guy an out. You always got to give a guy an out. Meaning, you've got to give a person an opportunity to maintain their dignity and walk away, because otherwise they have to swing to protect that affront to dignity. They've lost their dignity. And the culture of men cannot tolerate that, right? So I just want to say, my real teachings of this are probably from my father as well, and my mother, so thanks.
The word I'm looking at is rage on the page. And again, for me, it's a political thing around emotions, because I think our profession sanitizes a lot of our feelings and the emotions. And again, I think that's a political thing. And I think anger and rage is one. And when we have, terms like anger management. But when we talk about working with rage with the people that we work with, I think it makes perfect sense. And again, I would be, when you say when people don't have shame, when people don't have rage, I'm thinking we should have, because for me, when I think of rage, I think of a sense of justice. And interesting, my personal story of shame is attached to my rage. And when you're working class Belfast, you kind of get born with, your thumb in your mouth and rage. You're stuck on that sense of rage of what's happened to your country. And then the double whammy is not to give that rage a name. And so what a lot of my fellow country men did, and some of my fellow country women, is they picked up a gun in the name of that rage. And then you had to either choose sides. So you were either pro-terrorist, because apparently I'm a terrorist, or you were anti. And because again I chose the path of the pacifist, but there was, well, what do you do with the rage, and where does it go, and what name do you give to something that's saying, I know this is a great injustice. It's a great injustice to have your country colonised. And again, therapeutically, it's exactly the same thing. When I have these conversations therapeutically with boys, we see a lot of boys who, again, relating with aggression, it just makes perfect sense to me. I think, of course you should be raised about what happened to you in your life, but it's what you do with that rage. Do you pick up the gun, or do you not pick up, the gun? You pick up the, the sword or the pen. And so I think when, certainly I know what I've done in conversations, and there's one young man at the moment, he's about to finish some of his conversations with me, and the big thing for him, and I wish I could claim my clinical skills for what helped him through, he said, you were reasonable. I thought, oh, no, that's lovely, reasonable. Put that one on your CV, you were reasonable. And again, curious, reasonable about what? Well, again, it was those moments. He said things like, when I showed you my, and he used words like rage and anger, and I'm thinking, but it makes sense to me that you would have those feelings, and if you're courageous enough to tell me about them, then I need to be courageous enough to sit beside you and be curious about them and have a relationship with the rage and be interested in what it's saying to you and what it's saying to me. And then how does the rage that's come from your sense of injustice, how does that get passed on to another and passed on to another? So feelings for me are political, so they are, and say particularly those feelings that we in the therapeutic world want to clean up and sanitize. I think it's time to say to rage, yeah, you're okay, tell me, what is the story behind your existence? Because it's just another emotion, it's just energy flowing energy, moving energy, it's got its own story behind it. So the more we're comfortable with our own rage, certainly when I am more comfortable with mine, and it didn't scare me, and I was able to use it in a very different way, the more I think we can have those conversations with and not sanitize it. And I think then that connects with shame then to me, because when we do that, we can hold the rage and the shame kind of equal, and then it's not shameful to say, oh yeah, you're right, this is what I'm feeling, or and these are the choices, whether to act it or not. I quite like rage actually now. She's okay. He or she's okay.
I tell you, the first thing that came to my mind in terms of thinking about the question of inadvertently enabling a man's violence to continue, or minimising a man's violence, I just had a bit of a flood of early stories that came back to me, and I remember being quite seduced by a young man who was quite engaging, and when I say seduced, I mean, you know, hoodwinked, had the wool pulled over my eyes. I didn't see. I bought his story, and yeah, he came to see me because he wanted entry to a group. You know, when we talked about that, he talked to me about his high social profile and that a group wouldn't be particularly helpful for his reputation in the community, blah, 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 blah. And I bought that, and I saw him, continue to see him in individual sessions. But part of our policy was that we would stay connected to his female partner. And after about a month, I suppose, I connected with his female partner, and we had a time together, and I discovered that he had been continuing his verbal abuse, his emotional abuse, and his physical abuse of her. And wow, it was a really good teacher for me about how it's very easy to be drawn into that space of kind of aligning myself with his violence and abuse. So yeah, that's the first story that came to mind. So I think particularly in the group programs, it was really important for us to have close connections with the female partners, to hear their stories of their safety, to prioritise their safety, to act in a way that wasn't continuing to hold them in relationships or in positions where they were unsafe. So, you know, that could require a number of different interventions, which might be for the man while he's doing the group to move out, or something like that. You know, some safety mechanism. So I'm not sure if that's what came to mind. Yeah, holding a position of therapeutic love while being appalled by what the man has. I think by what the man's done. I think for me that it comes back to the word respect. And I loved Vicky's statement about, if I can get it right, a man is much more than the worst thing that he's ever done, something like that. So holding that position of not thinking of him as a violent man, but as a man who uses violence, looking for and listening for evidence of his internalised ethics, listening for his statements about the kind of man that he sees himself as being, listening for the kind of statements that tell me something about his driving passions, the deep down in his heart passions about who he sees himself as being in the world, and responding to that and helping him to connect more strongly with those. So that's the beginning answer.
But maybe we'll just do this way. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm going to speak to that as well. Therapeutic love is an idea that comes from a psychiatrist, Carl Tom, in Calgary, Alberta. He talks about interventions that are doing therapeutic loving or therapeutic violence. Not necessarily to be in a binary with that. And this has really influenced me a lot because, of course, love is the thing that ought not to dare enter the name of a therapeutic relationship. So the language of therapeutic love allows me to speak to the love I actually feel for clients in a way that is palpable and doesn't, you know, where people have an inability, apparently, to differentiate rape from sex. We can also not apparently differentiate therapeutic love from sexual intimacy, which would be the sexual assault of clients. So I'm not talking about having sex with clients. I think we've all got that one down. But when I talk about therapeutic love, you know, I'm a very communal person. My culture is Newfie and Irish and some British. Like, I come from an extended family with a real clan sense of belonging. And that belonging is at the center for me. So, in fact, I never see an individual person. Even if there's only one person comes into the room, I always try to bring everybody that we can get in there anyway, because I like a mob. But I am not trying to help this man. I'm trying to help this family and this culture. That's just the position that I take. It's communal. And most of us come from webbed cultures, and capitalism and individualism and Western societies have broken that down for many of us, but none of us come from communities that weren't actually collaborative and connected, right? What if Darwin was wrong? What if the people, what prevailed was not things in competition, but actually things that collaborated with each other? So I think it's far more likely that the species that continue to exist were species that collaborated, not that were in competition. So there are discourses we can use to take apart capitalism and individualism. It's all very political rant, isn't it? I'll get back to this. So in terms of therapeutic love, my love for this man, my therapeutic love for this man, my care and compassion for him, I want this man to be able to belong with his children again. Like I was saying about that guy in the downtown east side, he's never going to physically see his child again, but there's a belonging that can exist outside of physical experience, and that's a spiritual practice. I hold my grandmothers are with me right now. They passed on a long time ago because part of us are Irish. I have no problem talking to them. You want to be careful who you let know these things. Is this mic on? And so for me, in order to serve this man, I need to serve the family. It's never a question of enabling a man. There's never a juxtaposition of who is at the center. It's not a competition between the woman or the man. To serve him, to serve this client and have compassionate care for him requires the woman is at the center and the child's at the center. That's what he wants, or he won't stay in therapy with me. It won't happen. So in terms of minimizing and justifying, I seriously hold very close the women who are the victims of violence. I have an internalized other kind of thing, which also comes from Carl Tom. I use things like a solidarity team. When it's hard for me, and I've written about this, when it's really hard for me to sit in the face of a man's violence, I'm more likely to be terrified than appalled. And this is because in my life I have suffered the violent attack of men, not men in my family. So I am actually a woman. I was saying to somebody earlier, maybe it was you, I can speak out, but I'm terrified the whole time I do it. Even now while I'm talking, there's a voice of patriarchy saying little girls should be seen and not heard. Shut the F up, we've heard enough from you. Like, I always feel that. And I'm not going to any more counseling to get over it, by the way. So what I'm doing is making it public and taking space, just as an act of resistance against it, right? So I don't necessarily feel rage, but I often feel terror. Like absolute, because I've felt terror of men's violence in my life. I've experienced that in my body, okay? So when I feel that terror, I need to hold this man at the center. My job is to hold my terror at bay so it doesn't land on this man. He has actually not harmed me, and he's not responsible for my experience. I need to go to you and to my colleagues to hold me up so that I can be present for this man. And so in terms of, so I use an internalized other. I seriously have a sweet, darling friend called Julie. I have Julie sit beside me. It's an Irish Newfie thing, maybe. But I'm like, if Julie was listening to every word I said, she would stand up. This woman is a lesbian, and she is much stronger than me. She makes me look like a wimp. And she would stand up and say, Vicky, what the hell are you doing? Like, she helps me, call me to account. And to serve this man, I need to call him to account. What I was saying yesterday in a workshop is, as far as I'm concerned, what a therapist or a counselor is, the qualification ought not to be school. I think that's a class thing that divides really great helpers and allows a bunch of people in who shouldn't be alone in the room with people. But anyway, what in my mind makes you counselors, we create relationships of respect and dignity across massive chasms of privilege. Meet the person where they're at in the world and create a relationship of dignity and respect with them. What is the purpose of this relationship? The invitation to responsibility. From this place of relative safety and a dignified relationship, we invite the person to take responsibility for that which they have the power to make a real choice. If I hold man 100% to account alongside my compassion for them. If I do any less, I am not serving them. That's what they're coming to me for. It's not a hard thing to do, right? So that's how I do it. In terms of holding on to therapeutic love in the face of my own terror or into the face of witnessing acts that are appalling, what I do is, and I'm, scratch me, I'm just a drug and alcohol counselor. One of the things I learned from the 12-step movement is play the whole tape. That play the whole tape, like drugs are great, I went to this party, it was great. Yeah, play the whole tape. Yeah, well, and then I lost my wife, and then I lost my job, and then I was over. Play the whole tape. So when this man I'm going into experiences of what he said and did, the real impact of his work, and as Ellen Jenkins said, not just the real impact, the potential impacts. You hit her and she fell over and she didn't die, but you hit her hard enough, is it possible that she could have died? She could have. So it's just an act of luck that we're not talking about your murdered wife. Like let's go that far, because there's the potential impacts of violence, right? But in terms of holding on to therapeutic love for this man, it's not just what he's done. I want to play the whole tape of what has happened to him. Because when I start with men, particularly when I'm working with some men who've been violent in relationship, who are asylum seekers and survivors of torture, I start with what has happened to them and their experiences of being oppressed. And even when I work with young men in a, quote, drug and alcohol center who have hurt and violated women, I have not met a man who invented violence. I ask them, where did you learn about this? Do you know what it's like to be on the other end of getting hit? They all have. So I start there, and that's not minimizing, that's a way of grounding. And I'm not doing that to say, oh, you suffered, it's terrible. I don't say that. I say, when you were a boy and you were beaten like that, if someone had told you that when you were a man, you were going to hit a boy, what would you have made of that? And then we sit there with that in a very painful silence. Because did you ever make a vow to yourself that you would not be a man a boy needed to be afraid of? And how did you lose track of that vow? Right? So I'm holding 100% to account and acknowledging at the same time that he did not invent this violence. So I think that's therapeutic love. Therapeutic love is messy business, and I just kind of like what I said about my workshop. They're not really totally good feeling things. Change is discomfort in work, right? But I think a therapeutic love as an ethic can give us a frame or a container that can contain what is appalling, what is terrifying for us, and have some containment on it and allow this person to take some responsibility for that, but see that within a context in which they didn't invent this violence, and that they are also more than a perpetrator of these events, they've also been victims. And we have to be able to embrace that multiplicity.
I just wanted to draw attention to the diagram that I've put up here on the sheet of paper, and don't try to copy it down. I couldn't get it onto a wall, so come up in the break and take a photograph of it on your phone. That's the easiest way to get it. But I'll just walk you through it. It's from Alan Jenkins. It's called Balances of Accountability. I think of this as the kind of a major model for engagement with men. It's got 4 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4. They can be sequential, they don't have to be, they can be repeated in every session as a framework for thinking about it. But at the very top, it's got a balance between being accountable to women and children's experiences of violence, and over this side, being accountable to men's experiences of disadvantage. That's what we've been talking about really today, these two accountabilities. Accountable to women and children's experiences of violence, and we don't want our interaction or our engagement with a man to make it more dangerous for them, to make it less safe. We want every action that we take to contribute towards some kind of safety for women and children, right? So these 4 steps, they are accountable and make mention they come back to, and they acknowledge and validate men's experiences of disadvantage. If we're in doubt about men's experiences of disadvantage, then just get the film that comes out of today and listen again to the reality of the stories that we've heard about the reality of men's experiences of disadvantage. They are real, they are impactful. So addressing the overload, when he comes into your office, what's going on for him? Talk about connect with him around his anxiety, connect with him around what he's noticing in himself as he comes into your room, where he's down the power scale. The next one is to explore his ethical intentions. The one down here is reposition shame, and the 4th one is to establish an ethical journey. So you can actually kind of get the detail of that from Alan's book, Discovering. What's the first word? Becoming ethical, right? I keep forgetting that first word. So becoming ethical has this model. I find it a really helpful one, and it answers that question of how do I work in a way that effectively engages a man in a conversation around his violent actions and behaviours in a way that doesn't increase risk, that doesn't exacerbate the likelihood. So if I haven't addressed his overload, he's likely to leave that room. If we've got into a wrangle, if we've got into a dispute, if we've got into an adversarial kind of conflict, he's going to leave that room and he's going to go home and he's going to be a bit dangerous. A bit dangerous. But if I've addressed his overload and I've calmed him and I've connected with him, he's less likely to go home carrying anger and carrying kind of some maybe desire to get into a blue. The more that I explore his ethical intentions about the kind of man he sees himself as being in his family, the safer his partner and his kids are. The more I've helped him to reposition his shame, his enabling shame, pulling out his shame into the open so that it's an opportunity for him to really explore what this says about him as a man, that he's able to face up to his violence, that he doesn't like it. And the more that I've helped him to establish an ethical journey, then the stronger the safety is for his partner and his children.
So just quickly on the first two, the avoiding minimisation and justification. Again, I use Alan's model, but also the targeting safety. I always remember in all my conversations with men, even from the minute of hello, how are you? There should be the three present in the room, the women and children. And then the same with exacerbating the risk to women or children. I use the trauma model as well. So I often think about what is my duty to a man to keep him again at a resting state. And I mean, the only way to do that is to be respectful, really, in engaging with him. So the first 2 points, the justification and the exacerbating risk, are very clear clinical models. The last two, the invitation to replication and therapeutic love, kind of belong together. And it's interesting, me sitting here, about to speak about it. A minute. I'll speak in a minute.
Avoiding and enabling or the excuses that would come, that I've experienced with coming from Aboriginal men who I've counselled and supported around their own personal issues, is one where Aboriginal people have been victim to so much abuse themselves that it's really quite a norm to put a lot of blame onto the out there world. The out there world might be the police, or it might be the legal system, it might be the bloody road rules or the car, or it might be the partner who won't shut up and listen or won't stop talking. So there's a possibility that that can be used as a real justification. The victimisation can be used as a real justification for their behaviour and for what's going on. So having that conversation with the client or with the man in regards to what's going on for him and bringing the ownership back into his personal accountability and responsibility has to be at the forefront to eliminate that projection of blame or the enabling at any level. But at the same time, we've got to acknowledge and this is a bit difficult, it's easy for me to do by way of the fact that I'm an Aboriginal man sitting in the company of another Aboriginal man. I can empathise and sympathise about his journey, whereas for you as a non-Aboriginal person sitting in the room with an Aboriginal man, you're going to be deemed to be patronising or condescending if you were to say, yeah, I understand and appreciate what you're going through, because he's more likely to say you have no bloody idea, and that's saying it nice, about what he's been through or gone through. So for me as an Aboriginal man to sit opposite another Aboriginal man and to hear his story about his hardship and the victimisation that he's endured and the lack of privilege that he's had in his life enables me to be able to better position myself to challenge him about what he's doing in regards to the abuse projected out to his family and his children or to his community, even to himself. So I would invite you to be aware of how, when you're engaging with Aboriginal men, how you do acknowledge that issue that will arise as a result of their feeling that they've been victimised, and how you present yourself back. You need to be, for your own safety, to be aware of that. It's also my experience that if you don't provide an environment on the very first contact that man comes into your office or into your room or into your service if you don't provide an environment where he feels comfortable or safe and respected, then you will not get him back in there again. And I can probably go so far as to say that with any man, not necessarily Aboriginal, you've got to do that straight up. You've got to provide an environment where, and I think, I don't want to preach to the converted here, but I think we know that you've got to provide an environment. Now, I look out into this room here and I see a handful of men and I see a lot of women. And it was difficult for me as a man, first of all, to go into a service and where I wanted to talk to about my issues, to go into a room where there was all women, because I had hurt women and I didn't want to be judged and I didn't want to be discriminated against as a result of my gender. So we've got to ensure that we provide those environments for any man, be they black or not black, where there is neutrality, and I think that will also enable us to be able to not enable them to project that the other parties or the other people or whoever else is involved is not a part of the problem, but the problem exists solely within them.
That was caught on camera, Mary Jo McVeigh being silent. So my sons would like to replay that constantly. What, my mother ran out of words? That was interesting. I think I'm ready now. Because my journey with love started when I was 3 years of age. And it was interesting you said about the voices that tell you to keep quiet. These voices are very powerful that tell me to keep quiet. It's a very loud, patriarchal Christian voice that say, you cannot speak of these things, Mary Jo. Because for me, it's not therapeutic love. It's love as a presence. And it made itself known to me when I was 3 years of age. And it's hard to put words to that when you're not then regarded as being kind of a bit, whatever they've called me in the years. The presence was first known, I can remember, was I peeped out from behind my mother's pinny. And if anybody doesn't know what a pinny is an apron you put over your best dress. Because you only have one best dress and then, it gets moved out. Anyway, so at 3 or 4 years of age, I peeped out from behind this pinny and I looked at this creature, this alien being sitting on the back step of our house. And his skin was so dirty, it glistened, like the paint on an artist's palette. It was that thick, the dirt on his face. And his hair was greatly matted, and his clothes were stiff with the starch of many months of sweat. And he was what we called a tramp. And there he was sitting on our back doorstep. And I remember kind of looking at him with fear, because he was alien and I had no idea where he came from or where he was going to go to after he left our back doorstep. And then I looked up at my mother's face. Right. She brought up 7 children in a war zone with not a lot of money and a man who struggled to be supportive. And she was washing this man's hands, and she fed him. And she didn't see him as alien or other. And a 3-year-old had no cognitive way to say what this 51-year-old is about to tell you. But this 3-year-old witnessed pure grace, pure presence of love. And I knew that that's what I was born to do. So 51, nearly 52 years later, when I've been told that I'm mad, where clinical teams have been advised not to have me as a consultant because I've turned strange, to which I told them, darling, I didn't turn strange, I've always been strange. It's easy when I sit in front of people who err, because they're human. And why it's easy to be with them is because they're my people, regardless of their gender or their culture or their age or whatever way they enter into my life. Because when you live in the presence of love, and with the presence of love you practice it as best you can. I happen to be lucky enough that my practice is called social worker. Somebody else can be the butcher, and somebody else can clean our streets for us. That just happens to be how I manage to live by the presence of love. But I will finish in Darwinism, because we did like old Darwin, did love him until I discovered something, that he is slightly wrong. It's not about competition. It is about collaboration, and is about love, and that's how we will survive as a species, and it will be the survivors of the fittest of all of us, because we will learn that killing each other is not the way, and hurting each other not the way.